Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, just pulled the trigger and leaked the details of the secret peace plan the Trump White House has been holding over his head. And let me tell you, it isn't a plan for peace, it is a self-destruction pact. We are talking about a 28-point demand that forces Ukraine to hand over its territory by Thanksgiving or lose every bullet and dime of American support. This is the moment the mask fell off. Zelensky just showed the world the receipts, and what they reveal about this administration's loyalty to Putin changes the entire game. In this town, silence is usually the loudest noise you'll ever hear. When the press briefings stop, when the Twitter feeds go surprisingly corporate, and when the usual loudmouths on Capitol Hill suddenly have scheduling conflicts, you know something ugly is going down. For the last few weeks, Washington felt like a casino right before the pit boss taps you on the shoulder. We knew the administration was cooking something up with Ukraine. We knew J.D. Vance and his little coterie of isolationist tech bros were locked in a room somewhere trying to figure out how to turn a complex geopolitical crisis into a bumper sticker they could sell to the base. But nobody, and I mean nobody outside of the inner circle, knew just how bad the recipe was going to taste. We all expected pressure. That's the game. That's how diplomacy works in the age of America First, which is usually just code for America alone. We expected the White House to lean on Zelensky, maybe threaten to slow walk a few shipments of artillery shells, maybe delay a loan guarantee, standard issue political arm twisting. But what we got wasn't arm twisting. It was a mugging. It started as a rumor on the encrypted apps first. A PDF was floating around, a draft. People were whispering about a Thanksgiving surprise, which in Trump world usually means someone is getting fired or someone is getting pardoned. But this was different. This was about the map of Europe. The whispers turned into shouts when my phone started blowing up with messages from contacts in London and Paris. They were panicked. They were asking if it was real. They were asking if the United States of America had really just sent a suicide note to Kyiv and asked them to sign it. And then Volodymyr Zelensky did the one thing the Trump team never accounts for. He refused to play the victim. He didn't just reject the deal in a private call. He leaked the whole damn thing. He put the 28 points on the table for the entire world to see. I want you to really understand what was in that document. I've seen bad treaties. I've seen lopsided trade deals. I've seen surrender terms dictated on the deck of a battleship. This was worse. This was a complete dismantling of a sovereign nation, drafted by American officials who are supposed to be the leaders of the free world. The document demanded that Ukraine cede the Donbass, not just the occupied parts, but the whole region, to Russia. It demanded that Ukraine cap its military, effectively neutering its ability to defend itself in the future. It demanded a permanent ban on NATO membership. And the kicker? It gave Zelensky a deadline, Thanksgiving Day, November 27th. Sign it by Turkey Day, or you're on your own. That was the message. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a mob boss telling a shopkeeper, nice country you got here, shame if something happened to it. The audacity of it is breathtaking. You have Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, guys whose foreign policy experience consists mostly of real estate deals and hotel licensing, sitting in a room with Russian advisors, carving up a European democracy like it's a distressed asset in Atlantic City. They treated Ukraine not as an ally holding the line against tyranny, but as a tenant they wanted to evict. When the leak hit, the administration went into full scramble mode. You could see the panic. They tried to say it was a draft. They tried to say it was just ideas. But the timestamps don't lie. This was the offer. This was the peace they were promising. And let's be honest about what kind of peace this is. It's the peace of the grave. It's the peace that comes when you let a dictator swallow his neighbor because you're too bored or too compromised to stop him. Zelensky's leak stripped away the veneer. For months, the White House has been telling us they just want to stop the killing. They've been shedding crocodile tears about the bloodbath. But this document proves they don't care about the killing. They care about the closing. They wanted a deal signed, sealed, and delivered so they could go on TV and claim a victory. They wanted to wash their hands of the war, even if it meant washing them in the blood of the Ukrainian people. By putting this out there, Zelensky forced everyone to pick a side. He forced Europe to look at the United States and realize that the cavalry isn't coming. In fact, the cavalry is currently negotiating with the enemy. He forced the American public to see exactly what America First looks like in practice. It looks like bullying a smaller nation into submission to please a tyrant in Moscow. This changes everything because it removes the ambiguity. We aren't guessing anymore. We know the price tag Trump put on Ukraine's freedom. We know the deadline he set. And now we are watching the fallout as the world reacts to the fact that the United States just tried to sell out an ally for a quick political win. The deal is dead, but the damage? The damage is just getting started. This is what happens when you let the art of the deal replace the art of diplomacy. You get a mess that no amount of spin can clean up. You know, there is an old saying in Washington that I have repeated until I am blue in the face. Personnel is policy. If you want to know what an administration is going to do, don't look at the teleprompter speeches. Don't look at the press releases. Look at the guys sitting around the table when the doors are closed. And when you look at the crew that cooked up this 28-point disaster, everything starts to make a terrifying amount of sense. We aren't dealing with the adults in the room anymore. Those days are gone. There is no Jim Mattis, no John Kelly, no one with enough brass on their collar to tell the president that selling out a European democracy is a bad idea. Instead, we have what I like to call the JV team of autocracy. You have J.D. Vance, a guy who seems to think foreign policy is just a subplot in a culture war podcast. You have Steve Witkoff, a real estate guy, whose qualification for ending the biggest land war in Europe since 1945 is that he knows how to close a condo deal in Miami. And you have Keith Kellogg, who has been orbiting the Trump universe long enough to know that the only way to stay in orbit is to say yes louder and faster than anyone else. This is the brain trust. These are the guys who sat down and decided that the fate of 40 million Ukrainians should be decided on a timeline that fits the holiday shopping season. And that is the part that really sticks in my craw, the casual arrogance of it. They treated Ukraine like a distressed property they were trying to flip before the end of the fiscal quarter. The specifics of how they tried to muscle this through are classic Trump world tactics. They didn't go through the State Department channels. They didn't engage with the career diplomats who actually speak Ukrainian and know the history. No, they set up a back channel. They tried to bypass the institutions because institutions have a nasty habit of keeping records and following laws. They wanted this done fast, and they wanted it done dirty. The deadline of November 27th wasn't chosen by accident. Thanksgiving. They wanted to serve up a peace deal alongside the turkey and stuffing. They wanted the president to be able to sit by the fire at Mar-a-Lago and tell the cameras that he brought peace to our time, just like he promised on the campaign trail. It was entirely theatrical. It was a deadline driven by domestic PR, not by the realities on the ground in Kharkiv or Kherson. But here is where they made their fatal mistake. They looked at Volodymyr Zelensky and they saw a mark. They saw a guy in a green t-shirt who relies on American money to keep the lights on. They thought he was weak. They thought he was desperate. They forgot that this is a man who stayed in Kyiv when the Russian paratroopers were dropping out of the sky to kill him. They forgot that he is a performer who understands the power of a narrative better than they do. When they handed him that paper, that list of demands that read like it was dictated by Putin himself, they expected him to fold. They expected him to say, "Yes, sir, whatever you say, sir," and sign away his country's future. They thought they had all the leverage. After all, they control the purse strings. They control the weapons. In their transactional, zero-sum worldview, the guy with the gold makes the rules. But Zelensky knows the game too. He knows that if he signed that deal, he would be dead politically and maybe literally within a week. The Ukrainian people have sacrificed too much blood to accept a surrender disguised as a compromise. So he looked at the JV team, he looked at their Thanksgiving deadline, and he decided to flip the table. By leaking the document, he didn't just embarrass the White House, he exposed their incompetence. He showed the world that the master negotiators were just carrying water for the Kremlin. And let me tell you, the phone calls I was getting from my friends in the intelligence community after this broke, they were stunned. Not by the betrayal we expected that, but by the amateurishness of it. You don't put a surrender demand in writing unless you are absolutely sure you can enforce it. And you certainly don't give the other guy a copy unless you want it to end up on the front page of every newspaper from London to Warsaw. The fallout inside the West Wing was instantaneous. I heard stories of screaming matches, of fingers being pointed. J.D. Vance, who has been strutting around like the heir apparent, suddenly looked a lot less like a genius and a lot more like a guy who got played. They were scrambling to find a leak suspect, scrambling to spin the narrative, scrambling to call their contacts in the media and say it's not what it looks like. But it is exactly what it looks like. It is a fire sale of American credibility. And for the guys in the room, Witkoff, Vance, the whole lot of them, it was a harsh lesson in reality. They thought they could run the world like a family business. They found out the hard way that when you try to bully a nation that is fighting for its survival, you might just get punched in the nose. And Zelensky didn't just punch them, he knocked them flat on their backs in front of the whole world. Let's get into the meat of this thing, because the devil isn't just in the details, he is writing the footnotes. When you actually sit down and read through the fine print of what Vance and his buddies sent over to Kyiv, you realize this wasn't a peace treaty, it was a liquidation contract. One of the most insane parts of this document, and believe me, there's a lot of competition for that title, is the proposal for a demilitarized zone. Now, in theory, a DMZ sounds nice. It sounds responsible. It reminds people of Korea or maybe Cyprus. But look at the map. Look at where they wanted to draw the line. They weren't talking about the pre-2014 borders. They weren't even talking about the pre-2022 borders. They wanted to freeze the conflict exactly where the Russian tanks are sitting right now. Think about what that means. It means rewarding the invader. It means telling Vladimir Putin, congratulations, you broke into the house, smashed up the furniture, and now you get to keep the living room and the kitchen. It legitimizes the theft. And the kick in the teeth? The plan explicitly stated that this zone wouldn't be patrolled by American troops. Oh no, we are too America first for that. The proposal called for European troops to man the line. The audacity is off the charts. The Trump administration wants to cut a deal with Putin over the heads of the Ukrainians, give away Ukrainian land, and then tell the British, the French, and the Poles that they have to send their sons and daughters to guard the new Russian border. I talked to a contact in Whitehall about this, a guy who has seen it all, and he was practically sputtering. He said, Rick, they want us to be the border guards for a Russian colony. And he isn't wrong. Then there is the neutrality clause. This is the one that really gets my blood pressure up. The document demanded that Ukraine renounce any ambition to join NATO for at least 20 years. 20 years. In geopolitical terms, that is an eternity. It is a generation. They wanted to strip Ukraine of its right to choose its own alliances, effectively turning it into a vassal state sitting in the gray zone between a predatory Russia and an indifferent West. We have seen this movie before. We saw it with the Budapest Memorandum in the 90 seconds, where Ukraine gave up its nukes in exchange for security guarantees that turned out to be worth less than the paper they were printed on. We saw it with the Minsk agreements. Every time Ukraine agrees to neutrality, Russia takes it as a green light to reload, rearm, and attack again. And the geniuses in the White House know this, or at least they should know this. But they don't care. This brings me to the resource angle. You can't talk about this administration without talking about the grift. Buried in the subtext of these negotiations is the issue of the Donbass resources. We are talking about lithium, titanium, coal, trillions of dollars in mineral wealth. When you see guys like Steve Witkoff involved, you have to ask, who is eyeing those contracts? Who is looking at the map of occupied Ukraine and seeing dollar signs instead of tragedy? It is the ultimate transactional mindset. To them, Ukraine isn't a nation of people fighting for their freedom. It is a piece of real estate with some complications on the title. They want to clear the title so they can get back to business with Moscow. They want the sanctions lifted, the oligarchy money flowing back into New York and Miami real estate, and the nuisance of the war gone. And let's not overlook the autonomous zones provision. The plan called for the occupied territories to be granted special autonomous status, essentially creating a state within a state. This is straight out of the Kremlin's playbook. It is designed to make Ukraine ungovernable. It gives Russia a permanent lever to destabilize the country from the inside. It is a poison pill, and the Trump team tried to force Zelensky to swallow it with a smile. When I read that section, I realized that whoever drafted this didn't write it in Washington. The language, the phrasing, the specific demands, it all smelled of vodka and caviar. It read like a translation of a Russian wish list. And that is the most terrifying part. We aren't just seeing incompetence, we are seeing alignment. The policy of the United States government was effectively outsourced to the enemy we are supposed to be containing. Zelensky saw this trap for exactly what it was. He knew that if he agreed to a DMZ manned by Europeans and a neutrality pledge that left him defenseless, he was signing his nation's death warrant. He knew that peace under these terms was just a pause button for Putin. So he blew it up. He leaked the map, he leaked the terms, and in doing so, he showed the world that the emperor has no clothes and the ones he does have are made in Moscow. I recall vividly the moment the talking points went out. You could practically hear the gears grinding in the Fox News green rooms from here. 1 minute, the peace plan didn't exist. The next minute, after Zelensky put the PDF on the internet, it was the greatest act of statesmanship since the Congress of Vienna. The pivot was so fast it would have given a lesser gymnast whiplash. But here is the thing about this specific brand of gaslighting. It only works if you control all the lights. And thanks to our friend in Kyiv, the dimmer switch was broken. We watched the surrogates roll out. You had the usual suspects, the Bannon adjacent podcasters, the think tank grifters hoping for a deputy assistant secretary gig, all trying to sell a surrender as a victory. They started using words like pragmatism and reality-based diplomacy. They went on television and looked the American people in the eye and said, look, Ukraine can't win, so we're doing them a favor by forcing them to quit. It was nauseating, but it was also revealing. For years, these people have wrapped themselves in the flag. They have talked about strength. They have unironically used the eagle as their mascot. And here they were, arguing that the United States should bow down to a dictator's demands because standing up for freedom is too expensive or too risky. They were advocating for appeasement in a way that would make Neville Chamberlain say, hey, tone it down a bit, fellas. The narrative they tried to build was that Zelensky was the villain. Can you believe that? They tried to paint the guy getting bombed as the obstinate one. They called him ungrateful. I heard one host on a primetime cable show say, we've given him billions and he won't even sign a simple piece of paper. A simple piece of paper. It was a death certificate for his country, you moron. But the leak short-circuited their ability to control the story. Usually the Trump team relies on ambiguity. They say one thing to the press, another to the donors, and a third thing to the foreign leaders. By publishing the raw text, Zelensky removed the ambiguity. He showed the specific, humiliating details. He showed the demand for the Donbass. He showed the neutrality clause. And suddenly, the spin didn't hold up. You can't spin a clause that says European troops will guard the border while America walks away. That plays terrible in Peoria and in Paris. It offended the isolationists because it still involved foreign entanglements, just not ours. And it offended the hawks because it was a retreat. It was a lose-lose document that only made sense if your primary goal was to please Vladimir Putin. Watching them try to clean this up was like watching a clown car crash into a manure truck. J.D. Vance went silent. The usually chatty accounts on Twitter started posting about culture war nonsense, anything to avoid talking about the 28 points. They knew they had been caught. They knew they looked weak. And that is the one thing this movement cannot survive. They can survive looking cruel. They can survive looking corrupt. They can even survive looking incompetent. But they cannot survive looking like suckers. And Zelensky made them look like absolute marks. He showed that for all their talk of being killers and deal makers, they got outplayed by a comedian with an iPhone. The anger inside the MAGA bubble right now isn't about the policy, it's about the humiliation. They are furious that their Thanksgiving surprise turned into a Thanksgiving turkey. They wanted a parade, they got a public undressing, and as we move forward, watch how they lash out. They won't attack the substance of the leak because they can't defend it. They will attack the leaker. They will go after Zelensky personally. They will try to cut the funding not as a strategic decision, but as revenge. Because in their world, the worst crime you can commit isn't betraying your country, it's embarrassing the boss. I need you to understand what happened in the capitals of Europe the moment that PDF landed in their inboxes. I have spent decades building relationships across the Atlantic. I know the guys in the Foreign Office in London. I know the serious players in the Élysée Palace in Paris. Usually when things get rocky in Washington, they call me and ask for a translation. They ask, Rick, is it really that bad? This time, they didn't ask. They knew. The silence on the line was replaced by a cold, hard panic. You see, for 70 years, the deal was simple. Europe stands with America, and America provides the nuclear umbrella. It was the bedrock of Western civilization. But that 28-point plan, it didn't just crack the bedrock. It put dynamite in the foundation and lit the fuse. The most insulting part for the Europeans wasn't even the surrender of Ukrainian land, though that made them sick. It was the clause about the enforcement. The Trump team, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the demilitarized zone would be patrolled by European soldiers. British troops, French troops, Polish troops, but not a single American boot on the ground. Think about the arrogance of that. J.D. Vance and his band of isolationist interns sat in a room and decided that mothers in Manchester and Lyon should send their sons to freeze in a trench in eastern Ukraine to enforce a deal that benefits Vladimir Putin while America sits back and counts the money. It was a let-them-eat-cake moment, but with body bags. I spoke to a senior official in London about an hour after the leak. This is a guy who is usually the epitome of the stiff upper lip. He was furious. He said they are volunteering our army to be the jailers of a Russian colony, and he was right. The White House wasn't treating the UK and France as allies. It was treating them as mercenaries who hadn't even been hired, just ordered. This shattered the illusion that there was any adult supervision left in Washington. For a long time, the Europeans hoped that the deep state, or what we used to call career professionals, would restrain the worst impulses of the MAGA crowd. But this document proved that the professionals had been purged or sidelined. The lunatics weren't just running the asylum, they were selling off the building. So, what happened next was a frantic reshuffling of the deck. Macron and Starmer had to have the conversation they had been dreading for years. The conversation about a Europe that stands alone. If the United States is going to cut side deals with Moscow, then NATO as we know it is effectively on life support. The leak forced them to confront the reality that they might have to fight this war without American logistics, without American intelligence, and without American leadership. And this is where it gets dangerous. Because a desperate Europe is an unpredictable Europe. The Trump team thinks that by pulling the rug out, they are forcing peace. In reality, they are forcing escalation. If Poland and the Baltics feel like America has abandoned them, they aren't going to just roll over for Russia. They are going to fight harder. They are going to look for other ways to defend themselves, ways that might involve things that keep people in Washington awake at night. Zelensky knew this, of course. He knew that by leaking the plan, he would terrify the Europeans into action. He showed them the ghost of their future, a future where they are vassal states to a Russian-American pact, and it worked. You saw the statement stiffen. You saw the sudden rush of pledges from the EU. They realized that they couldn't wait for the dealmaker to save them. They had to save themselves from the dealmaker. The betrayal here is generational. We are telling our closest friends that their security is negotiable. We are telling them that we will sell them out for a lower gas price or a pole bump. And once you break that trust, you don't get it back. You can't just tape the vase back together. The Trump administration has managed to do in a few weeks what the Soviet Union couldn't do in 40 years. They have broken the spine of the Atlantic Alliance, and they did it with a smile, thinking they were being smart. It is tragic, it is infuriating, and it is going to haunt us for decades. You want to know the part of this story that really makes me want to drink a double bourbon at 10 a.m.? It's the authorship. If this peace plan had been written by Henry Kissinger's ghost, I might disagree with it, but I'd at least respect the tradecraft. But it wasn't. So it turns out the Thomas Jefferson of this surrender document is Steve Witkoff. For those of you who don't speak NYC Swamp, let me fill you in. Steve Witkoff isn't a diplomat. He isn't a scholar of Eastern European history. He is a real estate guy. His entire career is built on leverage, debt, and zoning variances. And this is the guy Donald Trump sent to a room with Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, and a man who is essentially Putin's personal wallet to redraw the map of Europe. You literally cannot make this up. You have a condo developer from Manhattan sitting across from a Kremlin operative, and between them, they are deciding the fate of 40 million free people. And the result? The 28-point plan wasn't just friendly to Russia. There are linguists who have looked at the leaked text, the syntax, the phrasing, and they are saying it looks like a direct translation from Russian. Think about that for a second. The American peace proposal was likely written in Moscow, handed to a Trump donor, translated into English, and then shoved down Zelensky's throat with a sign here sticker on it. It's not just malpractice. It's being a stenographer for the enemy. I've been screaming about the useful idiot factor for years, but this goes beyond that. This is the useful co-conspirator. Witkoff and Kushner, because of course Jared is hovering around the edges of this, like a moth to a burning constitution, treated this negotiation like a distressed asset sale. They looked at Ukraine and saw a building with a bad lien on it. Their solution? Give the lien holder the keys and tell the tenants to get out. Zelensky's leak exposed this specific, grimy detail. By putting the document out there, he let us see the fingerprints. And the fingerprints don't belong to the State Department. They don't belong to the Pentagon. They belong to guys who think sovereignty is just a fancy word for air rights. When the news broke that Dmitriev was the co-author, the silence from the America First crowd was telling. They love to talk about globalists. They love to scream about shadowy elites selling out the country. Well, here you go. You have an unelected real estate mogul and a Russian oligarch cooking up a secret treaty in a back room. If that isn't the definition of a globalist sellout, I don't know what is. But Zelensky didn't just leak the text. He leaked the humiliation. He showed the world that the President of the United States trusts a guy who sells luxury condos more than he trusts his own intelligence agencies. He showed that the art of the deal is actually just the art of the fold. And for a guy like Trump, who cares about image above all else, having his best people revealed as Russian puppets is a wound that is going to fester. One of the most nauseating bullet points in this leaked roadmap to ruin was the demand for neutrality. Now, that is a word that sounds innocuous enough to the average voter in Ohio. It sounds like Switzerland. It sounds like chocolate and cuckoo clocks. But in the context of Eastern Europe, neutrality is a polite euphemism for defenseless. The document didn't just suggest Ukraine stay out of NATO for a few years. It demanded a 20-year moratorium. 20 years. Think about the cynicism of that timeline. It's long enough for Putin to rebuild his army, fix his logistics, and recruit a whole new generation of soldiers to finish the job, but short enough that the West will lose interest and move on to the next shiny object. This is the ultimate betrayal of the Reagan doctrine. I grew up in a Republican Party that understood one fundamental truth. You secure peace through strength. You don't secure it by forcing the victim to drop their shield while the aggressor is still holding a sword. But the MAGA right, these isolationist cosplayers, have completely inverted the script. They look at a Democratic ally begging for membership in the most successful defensive alliance in human history, and they slam the door in their face. Why? To please a dictator who hates everything we stand for. The leak exposed the lie about security guarantees. The Trump team promised Zelensky that if he signed away his NATO ambitions, the U.S. would provide ironclad security assurances, but we read the fine print. These weren't treaties. They weren't ratified by the Senate. They were executive agreements, handshakes, and we all know what a handshake from this administration is worth. It's worth about as much as a degree from Trump University. Zelensky knows his history. He remembers the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world because the U.S. and Russia promised to respect their borders. How did that work out? When the Russian tanks rolled in, that piece of paper didn't stop a single bullet. So when Vance and his team tried to sell him the same bridge a second time, Zelensky didn't just say no, he showed the world the blueprints of the scam. This demand for neutrality is effectively a demand for Finlandization, but worse. During the Cold War, Finland had to walk a tightrope to survive next to the Soviet Union. But Ukraine isn't Finland, and 2025 isn't 1975. Ukraine is a nation that has fought a brutal, bloody war for its right to exist as part of the West. To tell them now, sorry, you can't join the club because it might upset the guy bombing your hospitals, is a moral obscenity. And let's be clear about who this benefits. A neutral Ukraine is a Ukraine that Russia can manipulate, subvert, by insisting on this clause. The Trump White House is effectively agreeing to the restoration of the Soviet sphere of influence. They are redrawing the Iron Curtain, but this time the United States is helping to mix the cement. The reaction from the old guard, the few real national security hawks left in Washington, was pure horror. They see this for what it is, a dismantling of the post-World War II order. NATO was built to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. This plan keeps the Americans out, lets the Russians in, and leaves everyone else panicking. Zelensky's leak forced the NATO allies to confront a terrifying reality. The leader of the alliance is actively trying to undermine it. By exposing the 20-year ban, he put the ball in Europe's court. He asked them, are you going to let Washington dictate the future of European security, or are you going to step up? It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only card he had left to play against, a rigged deck. And now the pretense that this administration supports freedom is gone. They support spheres of influence, and they just assigned Ukraine to the wrong sphere. You have to appreciate the dark irony of history. Here we are, almost exactly 6 years after the first impeachment, watching the sequel, and like most bad sequels, it is louder, dumber, and has a much higher budget. I remember sitting in a green room back in 2019 when the news of the perfect call broke. We all remember the script. I would like you to do us a favor, though. It was a shakedown then, plain and simple. Donald Trump held up javelin missiles to force Zelensky to manufacture dirt on Joe Biden. But what we are seeing in this leaked document, this is the perfect call to. Only this time, the stakes aren't just a political campaign, they are the existence of a nation. The Thanksgiving deadline, November 27th, was the gun to the head. The document made it crystal clear. Sign the deal by Turkey Day or the spigot runs dry. No more 155 millimeter shells. No more Patriot batteries. No more intelligence sharing. They were going to turn off the lights and leave Ukraine in the dark with the wolves. This is the kind of leverage that makes me sick to my stomach. I've worked in politics my whole life. I know about hardball. I know about twisting arms to get a vote on an infrastructure bill. But threatening to cut off the lifeline of an ally who is being bombed by a war criminal? That isn't politics. That is moral bankruptcy. It is the behavior of a loan shark, not a superpower. The logic inside the White House, and I use the word logic loosely, was that Zelensky would fold because he had no choice. They looked at the burn rate of ammunition in the Donbass and did the math. They figured he needs us more than we need him. It is the classic mistake of the transactional mind. They think everything has a price. They think everyone has a breaking point that can be bought or bullied, but they miss the one variable that always trips them up: dignity. Zelensky couldn't sign that document. Even if he wanted to and he didn't, his people wouldn't let him. If he accepted a Thanksgiving surrender that gave away the store to Putin, he wouldn't be president by Christmas. He would be in exile, or worse. The Ukrainian people have buried too many sons and daughters to accept a deal that makes their sacrifice meaningless. So, the ultimatum backfired. Instead of scaring Zelensky into submission, it forced him to go nuclear with the leak. He knew that if the American people saw the or else, if they saw that their president was threatening to let innocent people die just to score a win for Putin, it might change the political calculus. And you know what? He was right. The moment the threat to cut funding was exposed, the narrative shifted. It wasn't about peace anymore. It was about extortion. It reminded everyone of the ugly, bullying nature of this administration. It brought all the old ghosts of the first term back to the surface. The America First crowd tried to argue that we were just being responsible with taxpayer money, but nobody buys that. You don't save money by letting a genocidal dictator roll over Europe. You just defer the cost to a much bloodier, more expensive war later. The Thanksgiving deadline was supposed to be a triumph. Trump wanted to carve the turkey and announce peace. Instead, he got a face full of gravy. He exposed himself as a man who would trade an ally's life for a headline. And for the guys in the Pentagon, the ones who actually understand logistics and strategy, this was the final straw. They know that cutting off Ukraine now doesn't end the war. It just ensures that the next war will be fought closer to home. And now, the White House is left holding a smoking gun that points right back at their own foot. If you want to see a masterclass in spinal removal surgery, you don't need to go to a medical school. You just need to take a walk through the corridors of the Russell Senate office building right now. I have spent the last 48 hours text messaging with men and women I have known for 30 years. Senators, chiefs of staff, senior aides. These are people who used to have pictures of Ronald Reagan in their offices. These are people who used to give speeches about the arsenal of democracy that would bring a tear to your eye. And now they are hiding under their desks. When Zelensky leaked that document, he didn't just expose the White House. He exposed the utter hollowness of the Republican foreign policy establishment. There used to be a time when a Republican senator would have looked at a proposal to surrender a Democratic ally to Russia and set the paper on fire on the Senate floor. They would have filibustered. They would have gone on the Sunday shows and called it what it is: capitulation. But that party is dead and buried. What we have now is a collection of terrified careerists who are more afraid of a mean tweet from Mar-a-Lago than they are of a Russian tank division rolling toward Warsaw. I talked to a chief of staff for a prominent senator, someone you would know, a guy who talks a big game about strength and confronting our adversaries. I asked him, is your boss okay with the 28 points? Is he okay with the neutrality clause? Is he okay with the European troops doing our dirty work? There was a long pause on the line. Then he sighed and said, Rick, you know the score. We can't get to the right of the president on this. The base loves it. They think we're owning the libs by cutting off Zelensky. Owning the libs. That is the level of strategic thinking we are dealing with. They are willing to dismantle the security architecture of the Western world because it makes the folks at a rally cheer. It is a level of unseriousness that is actually physically painful to witness. The leak put these senators in an impossible box. In private, they know this peace plan is a disaster. They know that handing Putin a win in Ukraine emboldens Xi Jinping in Taiwan. They know that our allies are watching and taking notes on our unreliability. But in public, they have to go out and defend the indefensible. So you see them doing the pretzel twist. They go on television and say things like, well, it's an opening bid, or we have to stop the spending. They pivot to the border. They pivot to inflation. They will talk about literally anything other than the fact that their party leader just tried to force a surrender on a free nation. And let's not forget the China hawks. These are the guys who scream all day about the threat from Beijing. They say we need to be tough. They say we need to show resolve. Yet here they are endorsing a plan that signals to China that the United States has no stomach for a long fight. Do they think Chairman Xi isn't reading that 28-point plan? Do they think he isn't looking at the Thanksgiving deadline and thinking, so that's all it takes to make the Americans fold? A couple of years of pressure and some mean tweets? Zelensky's leak stripped away their cover. They can't claim ignorance anymore. They can't say, we didn't know the terms were that bad. The terms are right there in black and white. By staying silent, every single Republican senator is co-signing that document. They are putting their names next to Steve Witkoff's and J.D. Vance's on the surrender paperwork. It is a tragedy of historic proportions. I used to work for a party that prided itself on moral clarity. We knew who the bad guys were. We didn't invite them to write our peace treaties. But the fear in Washington is palpable. They are terrified of the primary challenge. They are terrified of the donor calls, so they stay silent. And in their silence, they are complicit in one of the greatest geopolitical blunders in American history. Zelensky shined a light in the dark corners of the Capitol, and all we saw were cockroaches scrambling for cover. One of the most disturbing things about this entire fiasco isn't just what was happening in the West Wing. It was what was happening on the airwaves. If you have the stomach for it, and I really don't recommend it, unless you have a strong drink in hand, watch the clips from Russian state television and compare them side by side. The primetime lineup on certain American cable news networks, the synchronization is terrifying. It's almost as if they are reading from the same teleprompter. When the 28-point plan was being drafted, the propaganda machine was already priming the pump. We heard the same phrases echoed across the ocean. Stop the slaughter. End the forever war. Realism. It all sounds so reasonable, doesn't it? It is designed to make surrender look like mercy. The Kremlin's mouthpieces, guys like Vladimir Solovyov and Margarita Simonyan, were practically giddy in the days leading up to the leak. They were dropping hints. They were talking about how the new management in Washington finally understood the reality of the situation. They knew the fix was in. They knew that the terms being cooked up by Witkoff and Vance were terms that would effectively end Ukraine as a sovereign state, and they were ready to celebrate. And then you look at the American side of the equation. You have the influencers The podcasters, the guys who have turned America First into a multi-million-dollar grift, they were telling their audiences that Zelensky is a tyrant, that Ukraine is a black hole for corruption, and that the only way to save America is to cut them loose. They were laying the groundwork so that when the Thanksgiving surprise was announced, their followers would cheer for the betrayal of an ally. But Zelensky's leak threw a wrench into the gears of this well-oiled machine. You see, propaganda works best in the shadows. It relies on vague generalities. It relies on saying, we are bringing peace. But when you put the specific terms on the screen, when you show that peace means giving away the Donbass, banning NATO membership, and creating a defenseless buffer zone, it becomes a lot harder to sell. Suddenly, the talking heads in the U.S. had to defend the indefensible. They couldn't just talk about stopping the war anymore. They had to explain why it was a good idea to let Putin redraw the map of Europe. And you could see them struggling. They started attacking the messenger. They called the leak a betrayal of trust. They called Zelensky a saboteur for daring to show the world the gun that was being held to his head. It was a mask-off moment for the entire ecosystem. For years, I have warned that there is a pipeline of disinformation that flows directly from Moscow to the darker corners of the American internet and eventually into the mainstream GOP discourse. This leak proved it. The talking points were identical. The outrage was coordinated. The desperation to spin this surrender as a victory was shared by the Kremlin and the MAGA elite alike. What they didn't count on was the American public's ability to read. When people actually saw the 28 points, they didn't see a peace deal. They saw a shakedown. They saw a strong nation bullying a smaller one. And despite everything, despite all the noise and the polarization, most Americans still have a fundamental sense of fair play. They don't like bullies, and they certainly don't like seeing their own government act like the enforcer for a foreign dictator. The leak disrupted the narrative arc they had planned. They wanted a smooth transition from war to peace, just in time for the holidays. Instead, they got a messy, public fight that exposed the ugly truth of their foreign policy. And watching the propagandists scramble to pick up the pieces, trying to explain why neutrality isn't just a fancy word for defenselessness, was a grim sort of satisfaction. They were exposed. The echo chamber cracked, and for a moment, the truth got in. And the truth is that this wasn't American diplomacy. It was Russian active measures laundered through the White House. You want to know who wasn't panic dialing their therapists when Zelensky hit send on that leak? The guys with stars on their shoulders working in the E-ring of the Pentagon. I've spent a lifetime dealing with the military-industrial complex. I know the type. They aren't political. At least they try not to be. They care about logistics, throw weights, and the strategic map. And for weeks, they had been looking at this peace plan with a mixture of confusion and absolute horror. See, the Witkoff-Vance proposal wasn't just a political disaster. It was a military impossibility. The idea of a demilitarized zone patrolled by European troops sounds great in a think tank seminar room in D.C., but put it in front of a guy who's commanded brigade, and he'll ask you the hard questions. What are the rules of engagement? Who provides the air cover? What happens when, not if, but when a Russian mortar team accidentally wipes out a French patrol? The White House political team didn't have answers for that. They didn't care about the mechanics. They just wanted the headline. But the generals knew that this plan was a recipe for getting NATO dragged into a shooting war, but on the worst possible terms, defending a static line with one hand tied behind their backs. When the leak broke, I got a text from an old friend who works in intelligence. It was just a smiley face emoji. That was it. Because here's the dirty little secret. The deep state, the career professionals, the intelligence analysts, the logistics experts, they were praying for something to blow this deal up. They couldn't do it themselves. They are bound by the chain of command. If the president says surrender, they have to salute and execute the order. But Zelensky, he isn't in the chain of command. He is the wild card. By leaking the document, Zelensky effectively acted as a circuit breaker. He overloaded the system. He made the plan toxic. Suddenly, no general is going to sign off on sending equipment to a neutral Ukraine without 1,000 congressional hearings first. The leak froze the gears of the bureaucracy. It bought the Pentagon time to say, well, sir, given the public outcry and the exposure of the terms, we need to reassess the feasibility of the implementation. It's the polite, bureaucratic way of saying, we aren't doing this stupid thing right now. And there is another layer to this. The intelligence community knows that credibility is the only currency that matters in this world. If we sell out Ukraine, who trusts us next? Taiwan? Israel? South Korea? The analysts at Langley were looking at this deal and seeing a green light for Beijing to move on Taipei. They saw it as the end of the American security guarantee globally. So when the details spilled out the 28 points, the Thanksgiving deadline, the Russian authorship there was a collective sigh of relief in the quiet corners of Washington. The leak didn't just embarrass the political hacks. It saved the military from having to execute a suicide mission. Of course, publicly, the Department of Defense had to play it straight. They issued the standard no comment on leaked documents. But privately, there were high fives in the skiffs. Because for once, the cynicism of the political operators got checked by the hard reality of the battlefield. Zelensky showed that you can't just wish away a war with a real estate deal. And the professionals, the ones who have to count the bullets and the bodies, were grateful that someone finally turned on the lights before the politicians drove the car off the cliff. There is a rule in Washington that is as immutable as gravity. If you want to understand the policy, follow the money. And if you want to understand the disaster, follow the grift. When you strip away the high-minded talk about stopping the bloodshed and stabilizing the region, what you find underneath the floorboards of this 28-point plan is a financial scheme so brazen, makes a timeshare scam look like a charity drive. You really think Steve Witkoff and the boys were spending all those hours in a room with Russian emissaries just because they care deeply about the geopolitical balance of the Black Sea? Please, these are guys who measure success in square footage and licensing fees. Buried in the subtext of the leaked document and confirmed by the whispers I'm hearing from the K Street lobbyists who are already salivating is the plan for reconstruction. You see, once you force Ukraine to surrender the Donbass and accept neutrality, the shooting stops. And when the shooting stops, the building starts. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure contracts, roads, bridges, power plants, housing. And guess who was positioned to get the first bite at that apple? It wasn't going to be the Ukrainian companies that have kept the economy running during the war. It wasn't going to be the Europeans. The plan, as understood by the insiders, was to steer these massive reconstruction contracts toward a pre-selected list of American firms run by donors, friends, and allies of the Trump White House. It was the ultimate kickback. We will sell out your country, but don't worry, our guys will make a killing rebuilding the rubble we helped create. And then there is the sanctions relief. This is the big enchilada. The 28-point plan didn't explicitly say lift all sanctions on day one because that would be too obvious even for them. But the roadmap was clear. Normalization of economic relations. That is the phrase they used. Do you know what normalization means to a Russian oligarch who hasn't been able to visit his villa in the south of France or access his accounts in London for 3 years? It means freedom. It means the money starts flowing again. There are trillions of dollars locked up right now, frozen by the Western alliance. The Trump plan was effectively a key to that lock. I have sources telling me that there were already back-channel conversations happening with major energy consortiums. They were getting ready to rush back into Russia the moment the ink was dry on Zelensky's surrender. The moral hazard didn't matter. The fact that they would be doing business with a regime that kidnaps children didn't matter. All that mattered was the quarterly earnings report. Zelensky's leak blew this wide open. By exposing the timeline and the terms, he made it radioactive for any Western company to be seen pre-positioning for the peace dividend. He shined a spotlight on the vampires before they could start feasting. And that is why the anger from the Trump donor class is so vitriolic right now. They aren't just mad about the bad press. They are mad because they had their spreadsheets ready. They had their profit margins calculated. They were ready to turn the tragedy of Ukraine into the opportunity of a lifetime. And this actor in Kyiv had the nerve to ruin the deal. It is disgusting. It is the commodification of human suffering. They looked at a war zone and saw a real estate play. They looked at a nation fighting for survival and saw a distressed asset to be stripped for parts. And the fact that the President of the United States was acting as the broker for this liquidation sale is a stain that will never wash out. We aren't just dealing with bad foreign policy. We are dealing with a kleptocracy that has gone global. One of the things that the spreadsheet commandos in Washington never seem to account for is the human element. They think you can plug national pride into an algorithm and solve for X. They think willingness to fight is just a variable that fluctuates with the stock market. But I have been to Kyiv. I have looked in the eyes of the people there, the grandmothers making camouflage nets in gymnasiums, the hipsters who traded their laptops for rifles. And I can tell you something that J.D. Vance and his spreadsheets missed. These people aren't looking for an exit strategy. They are looking for ammunition. When the news of the 28-point ultimatum hit the streets of Ukraine, the reaction wasn't despair. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, hard fury. You have to understand the psychology of a nation that has been fighting for its existence for nearly 4 years. They have seen their cities turn to rubble. They have buried their friends. They have lived through winter blackouts caused by Russian missiles. And then they hear that a bunch of comfortable politicians in D.C. want them to give up by Thanksgiving so the American president can have a nice talking point. It was an insult so profound it actually unified the country even more. Before the leak, there were cracks. People were tired. There were political squabbles returning to the Rada. But nothing unites a people like being told by a foreigner that they don't matter. The Thanksgiving surrender became a rallying cry. It clarified the stakes. It showed every Ukrainian that their survival wasn't going to be handed to them by the West. They were going to have to take it. I spoke with a journalist friend in Kharkiv right after the story broke. He told me, Rick, if Zelensky had signed that paper, the army would have marched on Kiev. That is the reality the White House ignored. And if you dies Don R and Ram, Zelensky isn't a dictator who can just wave a wand and make the army stand down. He serves at the pleasure of a people who have tasted freedom and aren't willing to spit it out. If he had capitulated to the Trump-Witkoff plan, the government would have collapsed and the war would have turned into a chaotic, bloody insurgency that would have lasted for decades. The geniuses in the West Wing thought they were offering a peace deal. In reality, they were offering a civil war. The leak was Zelensky's way of telling his own people, I hear you, I see you, and I'm not selling you out. It was a message to the soldiers in the trenches that their commander-in-chief wasn't negotiating their surrender behind their backs. It bought him an immense amount of political capital at home, even as it burned his bridges with the Trump administration. And let's talk about the plan B that nobody in D.C. wants to discuss. By leaking this, Zelensky signaled that if the U.S. cuts the cord, Ukraine isn't just going to roll over. They are going to fight dirty. They are going to take the gloves off. We are talking about deep strikes into Russia. We are talking about targeting energy infrastructure. We are talking about a war without rules. Because when you tell a nation you are on your own, you lose the right to tell them how to defend themselves. The Trump team thought they could control the escalation ladder. They thought they could turn the dial down. Instead, by backing Ukraine into a corner, they smash the dial. Now, we are looking at a scenario where a desperate, abandoned Ukraine becomes a wild card in Europe, a heavily armed, battle-hardened nation with nothing left to lose. I tried to explain this to a Republican congressman the other day, a guy who usually gets it. I said, "You think cutting funding ends the war? It just changes the war. It changes it from a conventional fight we can support into a chaotic partisan war we can't control." He just stared at me. The talking points hadn't covered that. They never do. They only cover the easy answers, not the messy, bloody reality of what happens when you betray a friend who knows how to fight. The resilience of the Ukrainian people is the variable that broke the model. They looked at the Thanksgiving deadline and laughed. They have survived Stalin, they have survived Hitler, and they have survived Putin so far. They certainly aren't going to be intimidated by a real estate developer from Queens. The leak didn't break their spirit. It hardened it into something unbreakable. And that is a problem that no amount of spin from the White House can fix. One of the most predictable yet repulsive acts in this entire tragedy was the cleanup operation that launched about 6 hours after the leak went viral. I know these guys. I know how they think. When you can't argue the facts, you attack the character. When you can't defend the policy, you destroy the person exposing it. It is the Roy Cohn School of Political Management. Never admit, never apologize, always counterattack. So the order went out from the West Wing to the surrogates, the bot farms, and the friendly pundits: destroy Zelensky. Suddenly, my Twitter feed and yours, if you were unlucky enough to be looking, was flooded with the vilest garbage you can imagine. We saw a coordinated wave of stories about Zelensky's corruption. They dusted off the old Russian talking points about him buying yachts in Dubai or villas in Egypt. They tried to paint him as an erratic, drug-addled actor who was trying to drag the United States into World War III because of his own ego. I saw a prominent host on a certain network, let's just say his name rhymes with Schmanity, spend an entire monologue insinuating that Zelensky leaked the document because the money train was drying up and he needed a distraction to cover his own embezzlement. It was a masterclass in projection. Here we have an administration trying to sell out a country for potential real estate deals, accusing the guy fighting for his life of being the greedy one. But here is where the strategy hit a brick wall. Usually, this kind of slime works. It muddies the waters. It makes the average voter say, well, they are all crooks, so who cares? But this time, the smear campaign collided with the hard reality of the document itself. You can call Zelensky all the names you want, but you can't explain away. Point 14, which demands the surrender of the port city of Odessa, a city that hasn't even fallen. You can't explain away the clause that demands Ukraine pay reparations to Russia for the destruction of military hardware. Yes, you heard that right. The plan actually suggested that the victim should pay the aggressor for the bullets used to shoot them. When people read that, the character assassination attempts just looked desperate. It looked like what it was, the flailing of a guilty party. The juxtaposition was too stark. On one side, you have a 28-point surrender demand that reads like a ransom note. On the other side, you have mean tweets about Zelensky's t-shirts. I talked to a GOP strategist, one of the few who still returns my calls, and he sounded exhausted. He said, Rick, we're throwing everything at the wall, and nothing is sticking. The document is too specific. It's too damning. We can't culture war our way out of a surrender treaty, and that is the key. They tried to turn this into a culture war issue. They tried to say that supporting Zelensky is woke. They tried to tie the war to everything from immigration to gas stoves, but it didn't land. Because deep down, Americans understand the difference between a political debate and a sellout. The failure of the smear campaign caused even more friction inside the White House. I'm hearing about finger pointing between the comms shop and the policy shop. The comms people are screaming, how could you put this in writing? And the policy people are screaming, why can't you spend this? It is the classic downfall of the amateur authoritarian. They assume that because they have a megaphone, they control the truth. But sometimes a piece of paper is louder than a megaphone. Zelensky didn't engage in a Twitter war with them. He didn't issue a denial of the corruption rumors. He just let the 28 points sit there, glowing on everyone's screens, radiating the heat of the betrayal. He knew that the best defense against a lie is the unvarnished, ugly truth of what they tried to do to him. And watching the MAGA noise machine grind its gears, trying to crush him, only to burn out its own engine, was a grim reminder that reality eventually gets a vote.